Hi, I'm Peter J. Rea. Welcome. Today's topic is Doren Eugene Rea, 1898 to 1974. Doren Rea was my father's father, so he was my grandfather. And today's video is a talk that he gave at the Torch Club in Sandusky, Ohio on December 19th, 1973, called A 50-Year Look at Credit and Collection. And it's also the Zook Family Memories Collection, or ZFMC number 8, which was published on May 5th, 1988. And before there's a prologue that I wrote at the time, quote, This ZFMC selection was written by my grandfather Ray, and the appendix was written by his son and my father, John S. Ray. I know all of you will enjoy the pages which follow. I have a long written recollection of Doren's bride, my dad's mother, and my grandmother, Gertrude Zook Rea. Well, we already did that. Okay, so, all right, so let's get started. Quote, Doren Eugene Rea, quote, As most of you know, I am listed as an accountant on Torch Club records. So when Jim Marshall called me up last summer and asked if I would give a paper, my first thought was that accounting would be a rather dry subject, and probably not too interesting to most of you. So I asked him if I could talk on something else. His reply was, You name it, and we'll all listen. The problem then was to find a topic I knew something about and would also make an interesting paper. After turning the matter over in my mind for several days, I decided that credit and collection of the accounts it generated might be interesting to you, and it was something I have been associated with for over 50 years. Hence the title of this paper. So let's start about 1910. My dad owned a grocery store in a small town in Illinois, and I worked in the store before and after school, and all day Saturday, and I mean all day. In the summer, on Saturday nights, there was a bandstand put up in the middle of the main intersection of the town, and we had a band concert for about 2 hours. However, for those who worked in the store, it was all work. The farmers would come to town early, give us their orders, and then go outdoors and visit and listen to the music while we put up their orders. I should tell you that this was not exactly a grocery store, although groceries were the main item. We also had hardware and queensware. How long has it been since you heard that word? And feed, bran, grain husks, shorts, ground finer than bran and middlings, coarse flour. Then after the concert was over, everyone would pile into the store to pick up their orders, and it would be 11 or 11:30 before everyone left. In those days, we had a sort of barter system. The farmers would bring in their butter and eggs, and we would give them credit on their account. On eggs, it wasn't so bad. You could sell them to the townspeople, but the butter was something else. We had a 50-gallon wooden barrel in the back room where about 80% of this butter was dumped and sold later for grease. I often wondered if those families actually ate that kind of butter at home. On the other hand, we had 2 or 3 families whose butter was so good we had standing orders from a number of townspeople for their butter whenever they brought it in, and we were able to get better than market price for it. Now about credit during that time. This was a small town, about 1,000 population. So a lot of our trade was with the farmers, and they paid you when they sold their hogs, their corn, their wheat, or whatever. And if crops were bad, they never got paid up. But I never knew of Dad refusing to let a customer have credit if he asked for it. I can think of one incident that I think will show you how store owners treated their customers in those days. This happened in late spring, and we had an exceptionally cold winter with lots of snow. As a result, when it finally did thaw, the roads were practically impassable, even with horse and buggy. We had no paved roads, not even gravel. Anyway, I happened to wait on this lady, and she told me that they hadn't been to town since last fall on account of the roads, and since they hadn't been able to get to town around Christmas time, could she pick out the Christmas present my dad always gave her? They owed Dad over $200. In those days, that would buy a lot of groceries. and she had already told me they couldn't pay on their bill until harvest time. I could hardly believe my ears, but I managed to hold my temper and told her I would have to ask my dad, who fortunately was in the back room at the time. After I had acquainted him with all the facts, he said to let her pick out whatever she wants. And believe it or not, she picked out a percolator. I can still see that percolator as she picked it off the shelf. This story has a happy ending, though, for come harvest time they did come in and pay their account in full. We are now all accustomed to getting statements compiled by a computer. In those days it was with pen and ink, and each and every purchase was itemized even though it only cost a nickel. Which reminds me of one 5-cent purchase that was frequently charged. 5 cents worth of fine-cut chewing tobacco. This fine-cut tobacco came in bulk in a long wooden pail, which we kept under the counter near the cash register. Whenever anyone asked for a nickel's worth of fine-cut tobacco, you reached under the counter and got a fistful, wrapped it in plain paper, and handed it to the customer. The men always wanted J.S., or John Stewart, my grandfather, to wait on them, though, for he had exceptionally large hands, and one of his fistfuls was about as large as a regulation softball for a nickel yet, and charged too. As far as collections were concerned, we sent out monthly statements, and that was about it. If and when they did pay, Dad always handed out cigars for the men and candy for the children. Not until he sold the store many years later did he place any accounts for collection. My next experience with credit and collections was with a large retail furniture store, which covered the period from the late 1920s through the Depression and on up to almost the beginning of World War II. The owner of this store was an innovator. He was the first in this town, Marion, Ohio, to sell items like floor lamps, tables, cedar chests, and the like for 50 cents down and 50 cents a week. You would be surprised how much volume we developed from this type of sale, and collections were surprisingly good, even though we were in a depression part of that time. We had a good credit bureau in this town, and all accounts were carefully screened. All were not accepted. This owner started something else that was new in this town. Furniture had always been priced the term price, take up to 12 months, no carrying charge. Cash customers were given a 10% discount. He changed everything to a cash basis. If you wanted to pay for it, okay, but interest at the rate of 6% per year was added to the unpaid balance. Most of the accounts were figured on a 12-month basis, but occasionally on a large order for a complete household, newlyweds, we would go to 24 or even 36 months. Of course, a chattel mortgage was taken on all these accounts, and believe me, they were all filed promptly. In those days, the chattel loans were doing a thriving business on account of the Depression, and if you didn't have your mortgage filed, their mortgage on household goods would take precedence over yours. I was never very proud of this collection procedure, but once in a while, in order to make a collection of an old account, I would threaten to reclaim their furniture, forcing them to borrow from a chattel loan in order to pay us off. That, of course, obtained our money, but it put the individual farther into debt because of the interest he would have to pay the loan company. During the 1930s, I don't remember the exact year, Ohio paid its World War I veterans a bonus. My boss really came up with an idea this time. Full-page ads in the newspapers beamed particularly to newlyweds or those couples who had been living with Ma and Pa during the Depression. Come in and buy a whole house full of furniture, no money down. Delivery free anywhere in Ohio. Pay when you get your bonus. The only requirement was the veteran had to show us his discharge papers. We sold truckload after truckload of furniture on this basis. The bonus wasn't paid for 2 or 3 months, but a few days before the checks were mailed from Columbus, another ad was placed in the papers advising all veterans who had bought furniture from us that we would cash their bonus checks. He was banking on the premise that about 98% of the people were honest, and they would come in, cash their check, and pay us what they owed. It worked out that way, too. Our losses were minimal, less than 1% as I remember. An interesting sidelight was on the day these checks arrived, we made arrangements at the bank to get $10,000 in cash and bring it to the store to handle the cashing of these checks. $10,000 in those days was an awful lot of money, so we had a city patrolman walk with me from the bank to the store for protection, a matter of 1 block. No incident. I can't resist telling you a story about this patrolman. He had been on the force for about 30 years, but always had been a patrolman. A good, honest cop, but not too good on paperwork. Anyway, here is the story. One Saturday night in Marion, Ohio, he found a drunk in the gutter on North Prospect Street. Since he knew he had to make a written report as to where he found this drunk, and since he couldn't spell prospect, he dragged him to Oak Street, a matter of 1 block, and then made out his report spelling Oak, O-K-E. During these Depression years, I used a company-owned Model A Ford car each morning to go out and try and make collections. The idea was to get them in the habit of paying something regularly. It worked out pretty good too, but I put a lot of miles on that Ford and knew every street in town. One account I still remember. I could never catch the man of the house at home. His wife said I would have to talk to Harvey. I went at different times of the day, no luck. So one morning I went early, about 7:30, and Harvey came to the door. Blue shirt and overalls, and so dirty you could hardly tell what color the material was. His hands and face were almost black. I supposed he was working the night shift and had just got home, so I said, "Just got home, Harvey?" His reply was, "No, I just got up." My memory fails me as to whether we ever got our money, but I think that was the turning point. Next comes the World War II years, OPA, gas rationing, and then the change from the corner market to supermarkets and shopping centers. I spent those years with a wholesale meatpacking firm, and now I was dealing with store owners in place of the store's customers. In the meatpacking business, you pay cash for the products you sell. By that, I mean when you buy cattle and hogs for slaughter, you pay cash right then, no credit whatsoever. As a result, our terms to our customers were weekly. Pay this week for what you purchased last week. This was accomplished largely by weekly visits of our salesmen who made collections and picked up orders for the next week. Most of our customers paid by check, but there were quite a few that paid in cash, and this presented a problem. 3 times while I was with this company, a salesman withheld money collected and applied it to his own use. It would work this way. Suppose the store owner owed for 5 invoices, which he paid for in cash to the salesman. The salesman turns in the money for 3 invoices and keeps the rest. Next week he turns in the money for the 2 invoices missed the previous week and withholds 2 invoices of the current week. If the salesman does this with a number of accounts, you can see that a fairly large sum could soon be built up for his own use. Sometimes it was rather difficult to catch up with these manipulators. Usually we accomplished it by sending statements regularly direct to the store owner, which of course did not jibe with what the salesman had been telling him. When the store owner complained to us about the difference, we would call the salesman into the main office, present him with all the facts, and in all 3 cases it brought a confession. This money that had been withheld by the salesman was made good by our insurance company, so we did not suffer any financial loss, nor did we prosecute. The insurance company then would try and collect from the salesman. But after this happened to 3 different salesmen in 3 different towns, we felt we had to be doubly careful whenever we hired a new salesman. You've heard it said that everyone has a little larceny in his heart. After the above experiences, I almost was ready to believe it. One of these salesmen who lived in Cleveland we caught right away, and the money had been made good by his wife, who was working. Shortly after this, I called up his wife to find out how her husband was making out, and if he got a job yet, etc. Her reply was, "I really don't know how things are going to work out. The other day I gave him $2 for car fare and lunch so he could go downtown and look for a job. And what did he do? Thumbed a ride downtown and bet the $2 on the horses." Of course, the horses were his downfall to begin with. During the early 1950s, the supermarkets and shopping centers started. The corner meat market was in trouble, and our problem too if we extended him too much credit. The established dealer who owned his fixtures and sometimes the building we didn't worry about. It was the man who started up a meat shop with no assets except a knife and a steel to sharpen it with. Everything else, fixtures, cooler, building, all on credit. He could walk out with his steel and knife and leave everyone holding the bag. Perhaps you are wondering how we came out on accounts that eventually became uncollectible and had to be charged off. In order to even out our bad debt expense, we had a reserve account for bad debts, setting aside each month 0.1% of our charge sales. But there were months we reduced this to 1/20% because the reserve was getting too large. Putting this in figures, it means on charge sales of $100,000, you would put aside $100 on a basis of 0.1%, or $50 on a base of 1/20%. Really a small expense for the volume involved. We are now approaching the 1960s, and the scene shifts once again, this time to an industrial plant in Sandusky, Ohio, where each sale runs from a minimum of several $100s to a maximum of $50,000 and up. The majority of our business was with nationally known firms where granting of credit was no problem. However, there was a very strict policy regarding the granting of credit to those firms that had less than an AAA rating in Dun & Bradstreet. All inquiries received in the sales department were first referred to the credit department for analysis, because when these inquiries were answered, price and terms of sale were both quoted. If Dun & Bradstreet showed the firm to have an estimated financial strength of $125,000 or over and a good payment record, we would advise the sales department to quote terms on an open account basis. Anything less than the above, we would either get a Dun & Bradstreet written report or ask for bank and trade references. After receiving this information, we could decide on what basis we would accept the order. Quite often, of course, we felt we could accept the order on an open account basis, but once in a while we would have to ask for payment before we would start production. Other times we would ask 1/3 at the time of placing the order, 1/3 when the order is ready to be shipped, and 1/3 in 30 days. With this type of credit policy, we had very little trouble with collections, and actual losses were minimal, to say the least. We would have a number of years go by and would have not even one bad account to charge off. Granting of credit under these conditions makes for an ideal situation. You have time to get all the necessary information together before making a decision, and the decision rests with the credit department, not the sales or production department. Now, a few observations about credit in general as it applies to an individual. How you handle your individual finance problems, of course, determines your credit rating. First of all, how much debt can your family safely handle? Here are a few questions you should ask yourself. 1. How stable is your family breadwinner's job and income? 2. What are the chances of layoffs in your occupation and in your area? 3. How long would unemployment compensation take care of your needs? 4. How long would your other financial cushions protect you before you could not meet your debt payments? This reminds me of the husband who had just obtained a universal credit card and was explaining to his wife how to use it. He told her she must realize that a credit card is a substitute for money. Each time she uses the card, it goes through a big computer, and they get a bill for everything she purchased with it. Her reply was, "Then what's the good of a credit card?" His answer was for convenience and for buying things on sale when you might not have the cash handy, and of course for establishing a credit rating. Well, at the end of the first week, she had established him a credit rating that would take 3 years to pay for. Seriously, though, a person's credit rating depends on how promptly he has paid his bills in the past. If you want to know what your credit rating is, you can find out by making an appointment with your local credit bureau, and they will go over your records with you as required by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You are usually rated by a code system, with a number code from 0 to 9. The higher the number, the worse the credit rating. The code is based on how regularly you have been making payments on various types of accounts. 30-day, 90-day, and installment accounts. The Bureau also keeps in its files past and present addresses, employment history, marital status, and lawsuits and other legal actions taken from court records. This Fair Credit Reporting Act also requires that most adverse information must be discarded after 7 years and bankruptcy notations after 14 years. You can also have placed in your file your own brief explanation of a dispute with a creditor. I guess this completes my 50-year look at credit and collections. It has been fun writing it and has brought back many memories and events that I hadn't thought of for many years. Thank you, Doren Eugene Rea. Now there's an appendix by John Stuart Rea, his son and my father, quote, "Reading my father's story about working in his father's grocery store in a small town in Illinois when my father was a boy takes me back to when I was a boy working in the summers in my grandfather's grocery store in a small town in Illinois. I believe my father worked in a grocery store in Aurora, Illinois, and I worked in a grocery store in Sycamore, Illinois. My grandfather was Frank Doren Rea, and my grandmother was Nettie Rea, and she was the bookkeeper for the grocery store. Her office was in the back of the grocery store and up a few stairs on a little mezzanine floor. She was a rather small, very refined woman, and my grandfather was a big man. The Sycamore, Illinois grocery store where I worked was on the main street in the downtown area. In addition to the usual walk-in business, telephone orders for groceries were taken, and groceries were delivered by a small truck operated by a man named Frank. Sometimes I went with Frank and helped him deliver. My main job at the grocery store was taking the stock off the shelves, washing the shelves, and returning the stock to the shelves. It was necessary to use a ladder to reach some of the stock because the shelves were quite high. I recall that some of the stock did not move from one year to the next. I particularly recall some cans of dark blue plums which never sold, and which finally started to leak at the bottom and left a big ring on the shelf. One of Grandpa Ray's longtime employees was a white-haired fellow named Sam. I mightily admired Sam because he was so deft in his ability to tie knots in the string used to tie up packages. It was a major event to drive from Sycamore into Chicago to see a White Sox or a Cubs baseball game. The large retail furniture store Dad refers to was Schaffner's in Marion, Ohio. He worked there during the Depression and walked to work every morning, walked home for lunch, and back to work. We lived in a big house on Windsor Street with many family members living in the immediate area. The meatpacking business referred to by Dad was Waldock Packing in Sandusky, Ohio. Our family moved from Marion to Sandusky the summer after I graduated from Marion Harding High School and before I entered Oberlin College, the summer of 1942. The industrial plant Dad refers to as Sandusky Foundry and Machine in Sandusky, Ohio, where Dad worked until he retired. My dad was a good father, didn't talk too much, gave excellent advice when it was needed, was not a slave to the material things of this world, had a great sense of humor. In his later years, became a pretty fair golfer. I was always a very steady, dependable influence in our home. I shall always respect his memory. John S. Rea, May 3, 1988. Now we have one comment here and the comment is from Augusta Smallshaw, my mother's mother, quote, "The Torch Club speech by your grandfather Doren Rea just arrived this morning. I decided to start reading it and didn't stop until I finished it. So very interesting to me, as it was just like the small grocery stores in Canada. Also the appendix by your dad. I just devoured them both. Augusta Fisher Smallshaw, Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada." Well, that concludes our talk today about the Doren Rea, my father's father. Good man. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.